The takeaway is supported by Progressive. Are you thinking more about how to tighten up your budget these days? Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save over $700 on average, and customers can qualify for an average of 6 discounts when they sign up. A little off your rate each month goes a long way. Get a quote today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary. Discounts vary and are not available in all states and situations.
I'm Melissa Harris Perry, and this is The Takeaway. Thanks for being with us.
We believe that the world must mobilize to counter this kind of Russian aggression should those tanks roll across the border, as we anticipate they very well may do in the coming hours or days.
For days, the Biden White House has warned that a Russian invasion of Ukraine was imminent. After a weekend of heightened tensions, the Ukraine border crisis entered a new phase on Monday.
Считаю необходимым принять уже давно назревшее решение. Незамедлительно признать независимость и суверенитет Донецкой Народной Республики и Луганской Народной Республики.
First, Russian President Vladimir Putin recognized the independence of two separatist regions in eastern Ukraine. They call themselves Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, or DPR and LPR. Now, they are not recognized by Ukraine or by other international actors as separate nations. But these areas have had considerable autonomy and been governed by Russian-backed separatists since the 2015 Minsk Peace Accord. Now, shortly after Putin's formal recognition, the Kremlin ordered Russian troops to enter the DPR and LPR on what the Russian Defense Ministry is describing as a peacekeeping mission. For weeks, thousands of Russian troops have been stationed along the Ukrainian border. And since December, Putin has tried to pressure NATO to decrease its military presence in Eastern Europe and commit to disallowing Ukraine from ever joining the alliance. Joining me now is Yaroslav Trofimov, who is Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Yaroslav, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
Now, first, what do we know about what has happened since the Kremlin ordered the troops into these regions?
Well, we know that the shelling along the contact line that has really picked up about a week ago has intensified. And the big question, of course, is whether these troops will stay in these statelets, the Donetsk and Lugansk statelets, that have all along been controlled by Russia, or will try to punch through. These two republics claim as their territory about 2/3 of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine that they don't actually control, including the big cities like Mariupol. And the big worry in Kiev, where I am now, is that they will try to seize these areas by force now that they have the backing of the regular Russian army.
Now, remind us about the 2015 Minsk Accord and how that agreement was reached in the first place, and what's been happening in these regions since that annexation of Crimea.
Well, the problem started in 2014 when there was an uprising in Kiev against a pro-Russian president, against his decision to cancel an association agreement with the European Union. And following that uprising, President Yanukovych fled to Russia, and Russia tried to foment separatist feelings in many areas of eastern and southern Ukraine. They were unsuccessful in most of them, but they did have success in these two regions, Donetsk and Lugansk, after which there was a Ukrainian attempt to retake them militarily. And Ukraine was successful in many parts of those regions, but then Russia sent more troops and tanks across the border. And in 2015, when the latest round of major fighting happened, imposed on Ukraine the so-called Minsk Agreements, under which Ukraine was committed to enter into negotiations and to, in Russia's interpretation, grant these regions say in the national political setup. Since then, these talks didn't go anywhere, and by officially recognizing these two statelets, Russia effectively abrogated the Minsk Agreements and withdrew from them.
President Putin has been describing the Russian relationship with Ukraine as basically none of the business of NATO allies or of the West. He's saying that these nations, Russia and Ukraine, are connected by shared culture, history, that Ukraine is part of, my understanding, he said sort of the spiritual connection to the Russian people. So talk to me about Ukrainians living in the eastern regions, these kind of separatist regions, and whether or not they genuinely want to be separate nations or statelets, as you've described them here, or whether or not this is really rhetoric from Moscow.
Well, there is a giant disconnect between what people think in Ukraine and what President Putin and many Russians think. As President Putin said yesterday, he believes that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people, and Ukrainians really want to be close to Russia, but unfortunately, they're governed by a Western-sponsored clique and sort of a regime, as he put it. In Ukraine, there is the issue of language. So about half the country speaks Ukrainian, and the other half speaks Russian as a first language, though they all understand Ukrainian too. But that doesn't mean that those Russian speakers want to be part of Russia. I mean, the current president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, grew up speaking Russian in a Jewish family. A lot of the ministers in his government are also Russian speakers, as are many leaders of the Ukrainian military. So language really doesn't mean this affinity with Russia. And even in Donetsk and Luhansk, which are only two small parts of eastern Ukraine, when the fighting started in 2014, a large part of the population fled to Ukraine, not to Russia. And even now in Kiev, there are tens of thousands of refugees from there who are prominent in the political life.
As you talk about this sort of disconnect between how the people of Ukraine and how Vladimir Putin is talking about this, talk to me about the people of Russia. What do we know, for example, about what the Russian media are saying about all of this, and sort of where Russian public opinion stands on the possibility of engaging in full-scale war?
Well, Russia doesn't really have a free media to speak of anymore. All the main TV channels are controlled by the state. And ever since 2014, they were pumping out the same message that, neo-Nazis came to power through a coup in Ukraine, and they want to slaughter everybody who dares to speak Russian. And so, in a way, Russia has been brainwashed with this image of, the brotherly Ukrainian nation oppressed by, the Western installed, radicals. And a lot of them do buy this warnings by President Putin that, Russian speakers are under threat in Ukraine, and something must be done to protect them.
Does that lead to public support for war? I mean, that's still another level of commitment of national resources.
Right. Well, I mean, Russia still claims it doesn't want war, even though it has deployed some 190,000 troops around Ukraine. And if it does enter a war, it will say that, the Ukrainians attacked us first. The Russian intelligence service warned just the other day that, they have spotted Ukrainian, soldiers trying to invade Russia, and they killed 5 of them, something that Kyiv denied as complete fabrication. So Russia's narrative is that, they are the ones attacking us, we have to defend ourselves, which is obviously the narrative that Russia used, for example, in 1939, when it invaded Finland, on the made-up pretext of having been shelled by Finnish troops.
So this weekend, there was a kind of tacit agreement in principle for diplomatic conversations, for talks between President Biden and Vladimir Putin. What is happening with that?
Well, Russia is a very centralized state, and President Putin decides pretty much by himself. And even his closest advisors don't necessarily know what's going on. And it's very hard to predict his next move. He also likes to be a master of tactical and strategic surprise. So it's true that just hours before his decision to recognize the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, the Kremlin issued a statement saying, we're committed to diplomatic solutions, including talks on the Minsk Agreement that he canceled just hours later.
This potential breach of the border, I mean, this movement into these regions, this recognition of these statelets, does this constitute an escalation to the point of saying, we've now entered into a military phase, or is this still saber rattling? Is this still brinksmanship?
Well, it is definitely an escalation, because by doing this, President Putin and Russia have basically violated the territorial integrity of Ukraine. and agreed that those areas, should be split off from Ukraine. But to be honest, Russian troops covertly, and not very covertly, have been in those areas since 2014. Somehow the Donetsk and Luhansk republics have more tanks in their armies than Britain or France in the entire arsenal. So it's not that the Russians haven't been fighting there all this time. Of course, with actual Russian troops being there openly, they could use things like air power that they haven't used until now. And be a much more formidable opponent for the Ukrainian forces.
Okay, can you back up to the point you just made about the level of weaponry? Help me to understand that a bit more.
Well, in Russia's narrative, these republics are sort of run by local miners and coal miners and sort of factory workers who somehow assembled at home this arsenal. But they do have hundreds of main battle tanks, more than Britain, more than France, and they have some of the most advanced weaponry in the world's arsenal. The one thing they don't have so far is air power, and that's one asset that the formal introduction of Russian troops could bring to the table, and that's one area where the Ukrainian military is completely outmatched.
Okay, so what does this mean for the NATO response? And even as you're saying air power, again, I live in North Carolina where Fort Bragg is here in our state, and we've been watching the deployment, particularly of the 82nd Airborne, over the course of the past week or so. Lots of young people heading into Eastern Europe at this time, and at all points being told that there won't be engagement in Ukraine, but your point about air power and sort of watching the 82nd Airborne from here in North Carolina heading over to Eastern Europe, I'm wondering what this could potentially mean, again, about NATO's response and even about what may be happening for U.S. troops.
Well, the U.S. has been very clear that no American troops will be going to Ukraine. The United States has withdrawn all its diplomats from Ukraine. The embassy in Kiev has been empty for more than a week, and just the other day, even the outpost on the western border with Poland was also evacuated. The U.S. does not want to be in the way if the Russians pour over the border and try to conquer the Ukrainian capital. So NATO's response has been in supplying weapons to the Ukrainian forces. But those are weapons that are useful more for tactical engagements, for guerrilla warfare, really. This sort of shoulder-launched missiles to take out tanks and helicopters. But they have not provided Ukraine with sophisticated air defenses, or even not sophisticated air defenses, that could allow the Ukrainians to stop, airstrikes, bombardments of their cities, or missile attacks from Russian forces. So it's been help, but quite limited help. The real sort of assistance right now is coming on the diplomatic front. We are seeing the European countries adopting sanctions. Germany is freezing the implementation of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline that would have allowed Russia to supply natural gas to Europe, bypassing Ukraine. So those and there is talk of more sanctions, of course, should the current steps be followed by an outright military operation to retake more land by Russian forces.
Those sanctions are likely to have a real impact on the people of Russia, not exclusively on the state. I'm wondering, based on what you were saying previously about sort of how the Russian people have understood what this narrative is as a result of being sort of bombarded by state media for the past, 7, 8 years now, how sort of an economic crisis might also be read in that context.
Well, sanctions obviously will hurt the overall Russian economy, but they're quite targeted. The European sanctions propose, for example, individual sanctions against every single member of the Russian parliament that's supposed to vote to endorse this recognition. And the gas pipeline sanctions are also, they have a leverage, because right now Ukraine is very important to Russia. That's the pipelines through which some of the main pipelines through which Russia exports its natural gas to Europe go through Ukraine. Now, if Nord Stream 2 were to proceed, Ukraine would no longer be getting that money, and that would sort of untie Russia's hands when it comes to Ukraine. So that's an instrument that actually affects the calculations of the Russian government, because the income from this natural gas is a vital source of income for the Russian economy.
Just one last question for you, and it's about the people of Ukraine right now and what the mood, concern, and preparations of the people of Ukraine are at this moment.
Well, there's calm in the streets. There is no panic. There is no hoarding. People haven't run out of toilet paper or basic staples in the supermarkets. The restaurants are full in the evening. There is a sense of disbelief. Why would in the 21st century some foreign power decide to invade a capital city of 3 million people that's living a peaceful life like every other European capital? But people are also getting ready for a fight. People are training for the local territorial defense units. People are joining the military, and they're not ready to surrender.
Maybe I should ask one last question, and that is, can you respond to that hypothetical that you laid out there? Why in the 21st century would a foreign nation invade a peaceful European capital of some 3 million people?
Well, I think because President Putin is trying to correct what he sees as the greatest, as he actually put it, the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, which for him was the collapse of the Soviet Union, a process during which Russia lost control of Ukraine.
Yaroslav Trofimov is the chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
This week on the New Yorker Radio Hour, an honest conversation about returning to the office.
Forced communal lunches or the strongly suggested communal lunch. Open floor plan. Coming back to work is partially about surveillance and micromanagement, and people of color feel that in a different way. Everybody feels it, but people of color feel it in a different way.
That's the New Yorker Radio Hour from WNYC Studios. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.